In a modern city buzzing with life and energy, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling metropolis. Amidst the throngs of students heading to school, one girl stood out not because of her appearance, but because of what she hid underneath. Sarah James, a 16-year-old, walked briskly towards Greenwood High School, her face obscured by a pristine white mask and her hands encased in gloves. This was her armor against a world that had once been unbearably cruel. Every morning began the same for Sarah. As dawn broke, her mother, Mrs. James, would gently wake her, saying, "Sarah, it's time to get ready for school," her voice always tinged with a hint of worry. "Yes," Mother Sarah would respond, her voice slightly muffled by the mask she wore even at home. In the small but cosy kitchen, Mr. James prepared breakfast, his heart aching at the sight of his daughter's hidden face. "Good morning, my dear," he greeted her with forced cheerfulness. "Good morning," Father Sarah replied, sitting down to eat. The warmth of her parents' love was palpable, but it couldn't completely shield her from the outside world. As she prepared to leave, her parents exchanged a worried glance. "May God give her the strength to overcome this, Mrs. James whispered. "Amen, Mr. James replied, his heart heavy. The walk to Greenwood High was always a mix of anticipation and dread for Sarah. She had transferred there a year ago, hoping for a fresh start, but the mask and gloves made her an instant subject of curiosity and eventually ridicule. Entering the school gates, she felt the familiar sting of whispers following her down the hallway, punctuated by occasional snickers. "Look, it's the masked girl," someone would inevitably say. Sarah kept her head down, focusing on her locker, moving swiftly in hopes of avoiding any confrontations. But today, like many days before, luck was not on her side. Jane, a tall girl with a sharp tongue and a mean streak, approached her with her entourage. "Hey freak, hiding from the world again," she sneered. Sarah tried to ignore her as she always did. She had learned to keep silent, but Jane stepped closer, her voice dripping with malice. "What's under that mask?" Too ugly to show your face, the word stung, but Sarah remained silent. She had heard it all before and knew better than to engage. Just then, a teacher, Mr. Richard, walked by and cast a disapproving glance at Jane. "Move along, Jane," he said sternly. "Leave her alone," Jane scowled but obeyed, muttering under her breath as she walked away. Sarah felt a brief surge of gratitude towards the teacher, but knew the reprieve was only temporary. In class, she took her usual seat at the back. The lessons were a welcome distraction, and she immersed herself in her studies. Her grades were excellent, a fact that only seemed to annoy her bullies even more. They couldn't comprehend how someone so different could be so smart. Sarah looked up, surprised. Standing before her was Josh, the new student. He had a friendly smile and eyes that seemed genuinely curious, not judgmental. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Sure," she said softly. Josh sat down, pulling out his lunch. "I'm Josh," he introduced himself. "Sarah," she replied, her eyes returning to her book. Josh didn't seem deterred by her lack of enthusiasm. "What are you reading?" he asked. "It's a novel," Sarah replied without looking up. "Cool. I love reading too," Josh said, his tone warm and inviting. "Mind if I join you here during lunch?" Sarah was taken aback by his kindness. She nodded slowly. Okay, for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Josh was different. Maybe he could be a friend. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. As she walked home, she found herself thinking about Josh and his unexpected kindness. At home, her parents were eager to hear about her day. "How was school, Sarah Mrs.?" James asked. "It was okay," Sarah replied, her thoughts still on Josh. "Did something good happen, Mr.?" James asked, noticing the hint of a smile behind her mask. "Maybe," Sarah said, a small but genuine smile forming. "I think I made a friend." Her parents exchanged hopeful glances. "That's wonderful, Sarah," her mother said, her voice filled with relief. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she allowed herself to dream of a future where she could be herself without fear or shame. It was a distant dream, but for the first time, it felt a little closer. In her prayers, she whispered, "God, please help me find the strength to face the world. Help me find true friends who see beyond the mask." With that prayer in her heart, she drifted off to sleep, the promise of a new beginning shining like a beacon in the darkness. 7 years earlier, on a sunny afternoon, Sarah was just 9 years old in age when most children are carefree and unburdened. Sarah had always been a shy and quiet girl, preferring the company of books over people. She loved to read about distant lands and heroic adventures, finding solace in the stories that transported her far away from her small school. That fateful day began like any other. Sarah had been sitting on a bench, reading her favorite book during recess. Her classmates were playing nearby, but she paid them no mind, lost in an imaginary world. Suddenly, a group of children approached her, led by a boy named Paul. He was known for his sharp tongue and cruel pranks. That fateful day began like any other. Sarah had been sitting on a bench, reading her favorite book during recess. Her classmates were playing nearby, but she paid them no mind, lost in an imaginary world. Suddenly, a group of children approached her, led by a boy named Paul. He was known for his sharp tongue and cruel pranks. "Hey, Sarah, what are you hiding behind that book?" Paul called out. Sarah looked up, startled. "Nothing," she replied softly, clutching her book tighter. "Nothing," Paul sneered. "Come on, show us what you're reading, or are you too ugly to even show your book?" The other children laughed, and Sarah felt a pang of anxiety. "Please, just leave me alone," she whispered. But Paul was relentless. He snatched the book from her hands and held it up for everyone to see. "Look at this. She's reading fairy tales." How pathetic! The group erupted in laughter, and Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. She tried to grab her book back, but Paul held it out of reach. "Give it back," she pleaded. "Make me," Paul taunted, pushing her away. "You're so ugly, Sarah. No wonder you hide behind your books." Those words cut through her like a knife. Ugly, the word echoed in her mind, each repetition a fresh wound. The children's laughter grew louder, and Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. She turned and ran, the sound of their jeers following her. That night, she cried herself to sleep, the word ugly haunting her dreams. The next morning, she couldn't bear the thought of facing her classmates again. Desperate, she rummaged through her mother's closet and found a face mask. It was a simple white mask, the kind her mother used while cleaning to avoid dust. Sarah put it on, hoping it would shield her from the cruel world outside. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. James, were surprised but didn't press her for details. They could see she was deeply troubled. When Sarah arrived at school, the mask drew immediate attention. "Look, she's trying to hide her ugly face," Paul shouted as soon as he saw her. The taunts were relentless, but behind the mask, Sarah felt a strange sense of security. It was a barrier, however thin, between her and the world's cruelty. But the bullies wouldn't let her be. Paul and his friends surrounded her again during recess. "Take off that mask," Paul demanded. "No," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Leave me alone." Paul reached out, trying to pull it off, and Sarah backed away in terror. The next moment, there was a blow as his hand brushed against her face. Sarah felt a burning sensation, and then everything went dark. When she woke up, she was in a hospital, her parents by her side, their faces etched with worry. "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak. "You collapsed at school," Sarah, her mother said, tears in her eyes. "The doctor said you had a severe allergic reaction." But the doctor soon discovered it was more than just a physical reaction. After several tests and consultations, they diagnosed Sarah with a psychological condition triggered by trauma. The mask had become a symbol of safety for her, and any attempt to remove it caused extreme anxiety and physical symptoms. "Mr. James held Sarah's hand gently. "We are here for you, my dear. We will get through this together." The days that followed were a blur of therapy sessions and doctor visits. Sarah's parents were always there, offering their support and love. They prayed for her every day, asking for the strength to help their daughter heal. Now, at Greenwood High School, the pain of her past still lingered. Each morning she looked in the mirror and saw the same frightened girl she had been all those years ago, but she also saw the determination in her eyes, a resolve to keep going despite everything. As she left for school each day, her parents watched her with heavy hearts. They prayed silently, hoping for a miracle that would free their daughter from the chains of her past. The atmosphere at Greenwood High School buzzed with the usual teenage energy. Students rushed to their classes, laughed in the hallways, and made plans with friends. Amidst this bustling scene, Sarah moved like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only by the whispers and stares that followed her. Despite her attempts to blend in, her mask and gloves made her stand out. She was the subject of rumours and gossip, but Sarah had learned to navigate this world with a stoic calmness. However, the tranquility she had managed to carve out for herself was about to be shattered. Jane, a tall, athletic girl with a reputation for being ruthless, took a particular interest in Sarah. She saw the masked girl as a challenge and anomaly that needed to be understood and destroyed. It started with snide comments in the hallways. "Hey freak, what are you hiding under there?" Jane would yell, her voice echoing through the corridors. Sarah kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but inside her heart pounded. She had hoped to escape the bullying that had plagued her in the past, but it seemed like history was repeating itself. One rainy afternoon, as Sarah was walking to her locker, Jane and her friends cornered her. "What's the matter, Sarah? Too good to talk to us," Jane sneered, crossing her arms. Sarah tried to sidestep them, but Jane blocked her path. "We're talking to you," she said, her tone menacing. "I don't want any trouble," Sarah replied softly, her voice barely audible through the mask. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble?" Jane mocked. "We just want to see what's under that mask. Come on, take it off." Sarah's breath quickened. "Please, just leave me alone," she whispered, her eyes darting around for an escape. Jane's friend Rose reached out and tugged at Sarah's glove. "Yes, take it off, freak." Sarah recoiled, pulling her hand away as the panic that always lingered just below the surface began to rise. She felt trapped, her back against the cold metal of the lockers. Enough, came a stern voice from behind the group. It was Mr. Richard, the history teacher. He strode towards them, his expression firm. "Leave her alone and get to class, all of you." Jane rolled her eyes but reluctantly backed off. "This isn't over," she hissed at Sarah before walking away with her friends. "Mr." Richard turned to Sarah, his face softening. "Are you all right, Sarah?" She nodded, although she felt anything but all right. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." "Don't let them get to you," he said kindly. "If they bother you again, come to me." Sarah managed a small nod before hurrying away. The encounter had shaken her, but she knew better than to show it. Weakness only encouraged bullies like Jane. In the days that followed, the bullying escalated. Jane and her friends began to leave notes in Sarah's locker, each one more vicious than the last. "Why don't you just disappear?" read one. "No one wants you here," said another. Sarah tried to ignore them, but the words cut deep. She found herself dreading school even more than before. The mask and gloves that had once provided a sense of security now felt like a target. One day, while Sarah was eating lunch alone under the mango tree, Jane and her friends approached her again. This time, they were determined to make a scene. "Hey, mask girl, why do you always hide here?" Jane taunted, leaning against the tree. Sarah didn't respond, focusing on her lunch, hoping they would lose interest. She hoped they would get bored and leave, but Jane had other plans. "Answer me, freak," Jane demanded, knocking Sarah's lunch off her lap. Sarah gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "Please, just go away," she said, her voice trembling. "Or what?" Jane challenged, stepping closer. "Are you going to cry? Maybe if we see your face, we'll understand why you hide it." Before Sarah could react, Rose grabbed her mask and yanked it off. Sarah screamed, covering her face with her hands. The sudden exposure felt like a million needles pricking her skin. The other students in the yard turned to watch, some laughing, others looking shocked. Josh, who had been sitting nearby, immediately jumped up and ran to Sarah's side. "Leave her alone," he shouted, pushing Jane away. He handed Sarah her mask, helping her put it back on. Jane scoffed. "Why are you defending her? She's a freak." Jane glared at him, but the presence of other students deterred her from doing anything further. "This isn't over," she warned before storming off with her friends. "She's not a freak," Josh said firmly. "She's just different, and you have no right to treat her like this." Josh turned to Sarah, who was shaking uncontrollably. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Let's get out of here," Josh suggested. He guided her away from the crowd and towards a quieter part of the school grounds. They sat down on a bench, and Sarah tried to compose herself. "Why do they hate me so much?" she asked, her voice breaking. Josh shook his head. "They're just bullies. They pick on anyone they think is different." "It's not about you, Sarah, it's about them." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for standing up for me." "Anytime," Josh said with a reassuring smile. "You are not alone, Sarah. Remember that." As the days turned into weeks, Josh's support gave Sarah a glimmer of hope, but the bullying didn't stop. Jane and her friends continued their cruel antics, finding new ways to torment her. One afternoon, Sarah found her locker vandalized with paint. "Freak" was scrawled across it in bright red letters. She stared at it in shock, her heart sinking. Josh was by her side in an instant. "This has gone too far," he said angrily. "We need to report this." Sarah shook her head. "No, it will just make things worse." "They need to be held accountable," Josh insisted. "You don't deserve this." Sarah knew he was right, but fear held her back. She had learned long ago that standing up to bullies often led to more pain, but Josh's unwavering support made her reconsider. That evening, Sarah confided in her parents about the vandalism. "We need to talk to the school, mister," James said, his face tense with determination. "We'll go with you, missus," James added, her voice gentle but firm. "You shouldn't have to face this alone." The next day, Sarah, her parents and Josh met with the principal. They presented evidence of the bullying, including the vandalized locker and the cruel notes. The principal listened carefully, her expression grave. "This behavior is unacceptable," she said. "We will take immediate action." Jane and her friends were called to the office and given a stern warning. They were placed on probation with the threat of suspension if the bullying continued. For a while, things seemed to improve. The school administration's intervention deterred Jane and her friends from their overt attacks, and Sarah felt a sense of relief. But she remained cautious, knowing that bullies often found new ways to strike from the shadows. One afternoon, Sarah was working on a group project in the library. Josh was her partner, and they had chosen a historical topic to research. As they pored over books and took notes, Sarah felt a real sense of normalcy. "You're really good at this," Josh remarked, looking at Sarah's detailed notes. "Thanks," Sarah said, smiling behind her mask. "I love history." "Me too," Josh said. "It's like a window into other worlds." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crash. They turned to see Jane and her friends standing at the entrance to the library, grinning maliciously. "What's going on here?" Jane called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Having a little study date." Sarah's heart raced. "Leave us alone, Jane," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, we're not here to cause trouble," Jane said innocently. "We just wanted to see what you freaks were up to." Josh stood up, his eyes blazing with anger. "You have no right to be here. Leave or I'll report you again." Jane's grin faded. "Fine. But this isn't over," she muttered before turning and walking away, her friends following her. Sarah let out a breath. She didn't realize she had been holding. "Thank you, Josh," she said quietly. "We can't let them win," Josh replied, his voice resolute. "We have to stand up to them together." Sarah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Sarah and Josh walked together through the bustling hallways of Greenwood High, their steps synchronized in a comforting rhythm. Despite the recent bullying incidents, Sarah felt a growing sense of strength with Josh by her side. Sarah found solace in Josh's company. He was the first person, aside from her parents, who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. As they exited the school gates, Josh turned to Sarah. "Do you want to grab a snack before heading home?" he asked, his tone casual. Sarah hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Sure, that sounds nice." They walked to a small local cafe nearby, a quaint place with colourful murals on the walls and a cosy atmosphere. They found a quiet corner and ordered some snacks. Josh chatted about his favourite books and movies, trying to lighten the mood, but Sarah's thoughts were elsewhere. She had been carrying a heavy burden for so long, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. She glanced at Josh, who was talking animatedly about a recent science fiction novel he had read. "Josh," she interrupted softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Josh immediately sensed the seriousness in her tone. He put down his drink and leaned in, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind, Sarah?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to recount her story. "It all started when I was 9 years old," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was a happy, outgoing child, but everything changed one day at school." She told him about the playground incident, how Paul and his friends had taunted her and called her ugly. She described the overwhelming humiliation and the decision to wear a mask to protect herself. "I thought the mask would make things better, but it only made them worse," she continued, her eyes downcast. Josh listened intently, his heart aching for the pain Sarah had endured. "What happened next?" he asked gently. Sarah recounted the traumatic incident when Paul tried to remove her mask and how she collapsed, later discovering she had developed a psychological condition. "The doctor said it was a reaction to the trauma," she explained. "I couldn't bear the thought of showing my face or having skin contact with anyone." Josh's expression was one of deep empathy. "I am so sorry you went through that, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But you don't have to hide from me. I see you for who you are, not for the mask you wear." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. For the first time, she felt understood. "Thank you, Josh," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You don't know how much that means to me." "You are not alone anymore," Josh reassured her. In that moment, Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She realized that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to let go of the fear and start to heal. "Sarah, we will get through this together," Josh said, his voice filled with unwavering support. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of Sarah's revelation hanging in the air. Josh's support gave her a glimmer of hope, a sense that she could finally start to heal. Excitement filled the air as Greenwood High School prepared for its annual cultural festival, the highlight of the school year that showcased the diverse talents and traditions of the students. Colourful decorations adorned the school grounds, and the sound of music and laughter echoed through the halls. Sarah stood nervously backstage, her mask and gloves firmly in place. She had never participated in a school event before, but Josh had convinced her to join the traditional dance performance. "You can do this, Sarah," he had told her. "It's time to show everyone who you really are." Her heart pounded in her chest as she peeked through the curtains, watching the other students perform. The crowd was lively, clapping and cheering for each act. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Josh appeared beside her, sensing her nervousness. "Are you ready?" he asked, giving her a reassuring smile. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so." Their group was called to the stage and Sarah followed Josh, her hands trembling slightly as they took their positions. The music began, a rhythmic beat that resonated through the auditorium. The dance started smoothly, each movement practiced and precise. Sarah found herself getting lost in the music, her anxiety momentarily forgotten. The crowd's cheers grew louder, and she felt a spark of confidence ignite within her. As the dance reached its climax, Josh stepped forward and made eye contact with Sarah, signaling the moment they had planned. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped to the front of the stage, her heart pounding. Josh moved beside her, and in a swift, graceful motion he gently removed her mask and gloves. A collective gasp went through the audience, followed by a hush. Sarah stood frozen, the spotlight glaring down on her exposed face. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then Josh spoke into the microphone, his voice clear and strong. "This is Sarah," he said. "She's one of the bravest people I know. Let's give her the applause she deserves." The silence was broken by a single clap, then another, and soon the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. The overwhelming support from her peers was more than she had ever dared to hope for. She smiled, her face radiant with newfound confidence. The dance ended on a high note, and as they left the stage, Sarah felt lighter, as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The following day at school, Sarah was greeted with smiles and words of encouragement from her classmates. The cultural festival had changed the way people saw her, and for the first time, she felt accepted. Thank you so much for listening, she thought, reflecting on the journey she had taken. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to share, like, and subscribe for more. And remember, you're never alone in facing your fears.